We're really, really fortunate to have with us Terry Eagleton, who I'm sure all of you know is a Marxist critic and author of a large number of books, most recently this book, Why Marx is Right, which is for sale in the Houseman stall outside, and I really encourage you, if you haven't already read it, go buy it, read it, it's fantastic. It's the sort of book that when I was reading it on the tube, I kept wanting to kind of nudge complete strangers to read them out bits, you know, so I really highly recommend it. So Terry's going to talk about the book for about half an hour, and then we'll have about another half an hour for short questions. So without further ado, Terry.
Well, I've come here to put in a good word for Marx, which for some people would be about as perverse as putting in a good word for Jack the Ripper. Maybe Marx was Jack the Ripper, actually. It's about the only theory of Jack the Ripper that hasn't been investigated. You know, maybe he slipped out the back door of the British Museum when he got fed up with economics and just tailed off to the East End, you know, for a few hours. Fed up with economics, Marx very often was, of course, fed up with economics. He once said that he wished that he could be finished with all this economic crap. Maybe that's a translation from the German, maybe it sounds more imposing again. In other words, writing Capital, and get on, he said, with his big book on Balzac. He wanted to write on literature, but he felt that he had to write on economics, and the reason for that, of course, is an interesting one. The reason why Marx wrote so much on economics was to diminish its tyrannical power over humanity, so that, as it were, we wouldn't have to bother, you know, as much with all that rather dreary stuff after him as we did before him. Marxism, of course, Marx's own work, is not about labour, it's about leisure. It's about being relatively free, liberated from the determining power of the economic. So, you know, the best reason for being a Marxist, apart from just, you know, liking to annoy people, parents, best reason for being a Marxist is you don't like to have to do any work. Anybody who doesn't like to work, you know, should join the ranks straight away. That's really what Marx is about. Marx just wanted us to lie around all day wearing loose crimson garments, you know, sipping absinthe and reading bits of Homer to one another. But to do that for everybody, as opposed just to the Oscar Wildes of this world, who were able to do that, of course, meant an enormous economic transformation, so that people could be, as far as possible, released from the tyranny of labour into, if you like, culture, into leisure. Yeah? That's what Marx was all about. But to put in a good word for him, of course, is a problem. I mean, how do you justify a man whose writings gave rise, so according to some people, to, for example, a paranoid Georgian peasant who butchered many millions of his people, to a blood-stained Chinese dictator who may well have murdered about 30 million of his people, as well as more generally to, you know, a lot of misery and a lot of poverty and a lot of oppressiveness. I mean, it might be easier to justify Jack the Ripper than that, at least in the minds of some people. Well, that's a long story, and I don't intend to tell it here because it's told magnificently. Remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book. I'm afraid, although the comrade in the chair implied that, you know, urged you to buy it, actually there is not really a lot of choice over this, I may now reveal to you. I've ordered those doors to be closed and and this is the passport to the out, what they like to call the external world. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein once said, why do philosophers talk about the external world? He professed himself to be very bemused by that. I suppose he meant, among other things, external to what? That's another story. I won't, and what I have to say is not really taken, it's not pinched, you know, brazenly from this book, so that you will have no excuse not to buy it, so find out more of what I say. This book is, in a way, I suppose, among other things, my response to the Eurozone crisis. I mean, it gets me some euros so I can feed my family, not just talking about the Eurozone crisis, but actually trying to do something. I want rather to just step back for a moment and look at the extraordinary things that have happened since the new millennium, in the last decade or so, on the how much history is happening all around us and has been really over that quite remarkable period, remarkable both in the sense of alarming and also in the sense of exhilarating. If you think back only to 2000 or so, when most of you were sort of playing with your toys before primary school, if you think back to that, then the overwhelming sense one got was that history had sometime been locked. It had been immobilized. It was frozen in a pattern which, for the conventional wisdom of the day, would simply endure forever. Nothing significant would now happen. Of course, everyday life would rumble on, as it always does, but nothing momentous, nothing dramatic, nothing epic was now going to happen, and that was known in the jargon of the day as the end of history. History had come to an end in the sense that there were to be no more major crises, there were to be no more grand narratives, as some people called them at the time, and instead we had settled into a sort of pragmatic, post-ideological, post-metaphysical, post-historical world, some said, that would, as it were, endure for the duration. In other words, translating rather crudely, capitalism was now the only game in town, but other political possibilities were not only not feasible, but increasingly inconceivable. Yes, a lot of bad utopia, and that was the way that it was going to continue. Now, think how no sooner had that rather complacent and rather odiously smug doctrine been promulgated, particularly in the 1990s, hardly was it out of the mouths of various Western ideologues, neocons, neoliberals, and the rest. And just think of how quickly and brutally that conventional wisdom was shattered. 1 year into the new millennium, the World Trade Center fell on 9/11. I mean, of course, the second 9/11, and not the first 9/11, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. The date for 9/11, almost 30 years today before the fall of the World Trade Center, when the United States violently overthrew the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende of Chile and installed in its place an odious dictator who went on to massacre far more people than died in the World Trade Center. And I'm sure if you've been watching your Fox News, you will have seen how often that news item crops up, how often the first 9/11 is urgently discussed, the anniversary of the World Trade Center comes around. There was actually even a 9/11 before that, a kind of Ur 9/11, which was the birth of Theodor Adorno, but only right-wingers think that was a catastrophe. Now, it wasn't actually accidental. I mean, in other words, what I'm saying is this, that the enormous irony, was that, as it were, no sooner had the end of history been promulgated by various, well-heeled lackeys of the establishment, grand narratives were at an end, than an enormous grand narrative broke out around Manhattan and then at other places in the world, of course, Iraq and Afghanistan, and that was not accidental, I think. It's not just that one story ended and another story came into being, there was an internal structural link between them, because the proclamation of the end of history was, as it were, the triumphalist intellectual wing of what the West, after its victory in the Cold War, had actually been doing, namely riding, now feeling it had carte blanche, effectively, to ride pretty well roughshod, particularly over impoverished and humiliated and weaker nations, not least in the Muslim world. And it was that, of course, that then, among other things, unleashed the new grand narrative, the reaction towards all that of radical Islam. So, in an extraordinary irony, the very act, as it were, of closing down, or trying to close down, a particular history, succeeded only in prizing open unleashing another. It wasn't the first time that had happened. In a certain sense, it's quite common. If you think of the great revolutionary avant-gardes in art and culture of the early 20th century, around the exhilarating moment of Bolshevism, and then later the Weimar Republic, constructivism, futurism, surrealism, Dada, expressionism, and so on. Some of those avant-gardes wanted, in a certain kind of impatient way, to wipe the historical slate clean, create a kind of blank space in which their own utterly original creation could then take place. Yes, everything that happened up to 5 minutes ago was antiquated junk. Yes. The irony of that, of course, is that to create that space, to call an end to history, to do your own thing, is itself an historical act, is an act that will perpetuate history, pile more history on, in the very act, as it were, of trying to close it down. So we'd seen that paradox before. We'd been there before 2001. We'd even seen it in the case of Hegel. Hegel thought, in his typically modest fashion, that history had now culminated inside his own head. Geist had chosen this humble little German as the place in which to finally reflect upon itself and come to itself. And what happened? Well, unfortunately for Mr. Hegel, that simply succeeded in unleashing a new history as people like Kierkegaard and Marx and Nietzsche and others reacted against this rather preposterous claim, thus managing to perpetuate the very history that Hegel thought he'd closed down. So it was a certain kind of ideological triumphalism, a sense that grand narratives were over. From now on, pragmatism, the post-ideological was all we would have. It was that sense that ironically helped to trigger a new kind of grand narrative. The war between Western capital and the Quran, or let's say a certain rather fundamentalist and distorted reading of the Quran, that looks likely to set the pace for many decades to come. The result of that, in an interlinked way, partly the result of those ruinously expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, was a new crisis of capitalism, not the only cause, but certainly a momentously important one. So another grand narrative got underway on the heels of the one I've been speaking of, that suddenly, and one of the notable facts about that, one of the reasons we knew it was happening, we knew that capitalism was in crisis, was not only that people were losing their jobs or couldn't manage to survive properly, but that the capitalist media began talking about capitalism. Whenever they talk about capitalism, you can be sure the system is in trouble. Yes, there's not supposed to be a system called capitalism. There's just supposed to be a natural human condition called, freedom or democracy or free enterprise or private property, whatever you want to call it. Yes, when you talk about capitalism, you're distancing and objectifying and making visible what really should be the invisible colour of daily life itself. Any successful class system is going, it hopes, to be too close to the eyeball even to be objectified. It will be the very, the very medium in which we move, like, a fish in the waves. We take it that fish don't go around, theoretically reflecting upon the medium in which they're moving, and that's capitalism's ambition for all of us. When you get, whoever, however, says crisis, also says visible, delimited historical system. That's what began to happen. It was now possible to see this as a specific system, and that's, of course, what Marx had done first. In almost, you might say, what his originality consisted in, he was able, for the first time, to name, identify, objectivate, and fix historical limits to what was taken to be simply, as it were, everyday or human life. On the contrary, this was a most unnatural kind of phenomenon, against which, for example, some medieval ideologues had protested. They'd said, there can't be, you can't have a system based upon profit and acquisition, because that's against human nature, against feudalist nature, yes. And the compliment is then returned to socialism. You can't have that system because it's against human nature. That's part of what I think Marx managed to do, and It was what was done again in what is being done again in our own time, simply by virtue of the fact that the system is in such a deep crisis. You can't have a system in crisis without then inquiring into the mechanisms or noticing the mechanisms of that, and that makes the system, in that sense, newly visible. The crisis broke out, it subsided for a bit, I mean the economic crisis. Now, of course, broken out again on a huge scale, unless in case anybody's not noticed. But another incipient grand narrative that in turn may give birth to is, of course, the extraordinary proliferation, almost spontaneously, of a certain urge and thirst and desire for popular democracy, which, as it were, has struck like lightning. Extraordinary how quickly these phenomena can emerge almost overnight. It's true some of them can disappear overnight as well. But we're not talking about epochs or eons here. We're talking about how history can move so fast under people's feet that, for example, it takes theory quite an effort to hobble to keep abreast of it. We've all been used for decades, no doubt, those of us who've been around for decades. Nobody's been around as long as me. But we've all been used to the problem of, well, there's theory, but what about the practice? One of the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, I live in Ireland, quite a well-known recent Prime Minister, Gareth Fitzgerald, said of one, a political proposal, that's all right in practice, but will it work in theory? Now, however, once more, it's much more like the situation, I mean, just in this respect, not in any other respect really, of the early Bolsheviks, where things, momentous events, history is moving so fast on your feet that theory has to hobble very hard to keep up with it and has to keep trying to make new sense of it as the thing keeps the shift. Part of what you do when, like Marx, or like A Crisis of Capitalism, you make the system newly visible, you make it sort of strange, in a way, is that you show that, of course, it is quite recent, historically speaking. It has very specific roots and antecedents. It was born at a particular time in a particular way. And that's dangerous for our rulers, because whatever is born can die. Yes? And to deny one's birth is, as it were, to deny one's mortality, whether that's done by a social system or whether it's done by an individual. Freud has a lot of interesting stuff about how we tend to deny that we ever did anything as lowly as spring from the flesh or body of anybody else, and we prefer to fantasize that we sprang whole and entire and unblemished from our own loins or head, or whatever other part of our anatomy it may be that we sprang from. Once the incipient grand narrative of largely Western popular democratic demands and protests got underway, another incipient grand narrative then immediately sprang up in the wake of that, namely the Arab Spring. I don't mean, of course, that the Arab Spring is simply tamely taking its cue from what's happening elsewhere, but it's part of a wider and more general maelstrom of demands from people who realise that now the system simply won't work unless that kind of popular democracy is installed. So suddenly, astonishingly, only 10 years in from the new millennium, we were faced with too much history, as it were, rather than too little. And that's one of many reasons, including my extraordinary and splendid book, Why Marx is Not on the Agenda. They're jumping on my bandwagon, basically. I don't mind that at all, it's fine. Let me just say this, however, about Marxism. I've said that in a sense, his great achievement was to name, identify, distance, frame, objectify a phenomenon which otherwise tends to be too close to the eyeball, yes, for us to understand at all. Originality is perhaps not always what it's cracked up to be. There are probably greater virtues than originality. Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century critic, once said of a book he was reviewing that it was full of things that were both true and new. The only problem was that the things that were true weren't new, and the things that were new weren't true. Now, far be it from me to make that accusation of the great Marx, but I think there's an interesting point here, which I try talk about a bit in the book, which is that, of course, a lot in Marx is not original in the sense that clearly he didn't think up the idea of communism, which is an ancient, honourable idea. He didn't think up the idea of revolution. The modern epoch began and was defined by a revolution across the channel. Yes, he didn't think up the idea of class. Indeed, he and Engels specifically pointed out that class was not their own invention. People had known of social class long before. He didn't even think up the concept of class struggle, which was seen perhaps more specific and peculiar to Marx or Marxist work. No, I mean, you can find the idea of class struggle in the literature long before that, nor in fact, did he actually think up the idea of a historical series of modes of production. That was a fairly well-known idea in the Enlightenment, particularly in the Scottish Enlightenment. In the book I quote from the Irish poet Oliver Goldsmith, talking about that, talking about historical modes of production. If it wasn't for the rather archaic 18th century language, you could have sworn that was Marx. None of those things were new in that sense. What was new to Marx, what was, I think, definitively new, is what I will let you know if you approach me later after this lecture in private for a very modest fee. Oh, okay, all right. What was new, of course, was what we call, roughly speaking, historical materialism. Materialism was by no means new to Marx. Materialism was, of course, has ancient roots and was a dominant philosophy in the bourgeois 18th century Enlightenment, though I do in fact talk in this book about how Marx was aware that his brand of materialism was doing something quite new, and I think he was justified in believing that. Marx reformulates the whole idea of materialism, and very central to it, and so I argue here, is the human body. Is what is it that distinguishes this linguistic, creative, labouring, transformative piece of flesh, at least in my case it's very creative, transformative about yours. What is it that distinguishes that from a body like this? Yeah. And I think Marx has a lot of very fascinating things, both ethically and politically, to say about that, and you ought to read about that, because, particularly for those of you who are in any way concerned with cultural studies or literary studies, I warn you here and now that when you do publish your book, unless you have the word body in the title, it's not going to be read by anybody. And just a friendly piece of advice from an old timer. Well, in my day it was dialectics. You had to have the word dialectics in the title, yeah? Now it's body, yeah, so don't forget that. All right, I won't keep you very much longer. But let me just say this, that one of the ways in which Marx very much was, I think, original, was in his, and some of his followers find this a little embarrassing actually, was in his undying praise for the middle class. You can always distinguish, say, a Marxist from a postmodernist by the fact that the Marxist is going to spend a lot of tedious time telling you how great the middle classes are, yes. That's a mark of Marxism, yes. Meaning, of course, not least in Marx's own work, that if you read the Communist Manifesto and other parts of his work, what he sees is that rather than making moralistic judgments, how bad the middle classes are, he sees that they were the greatest revolutionary agent in human history to date. That in a very few centuries, they had swept aside almost every vestige of the ancien regimes. Well, there is Prince Charles, admittedly, but by and large, yes, they've done that, and presented us with a startlingly new situation in which those regimes were as though they had never been, in many ways. In other words, that what Marx saw was this, that there were two tales to tell about modernity, about the period. One was a very depressing and pessimistic tale, the Jeremiah tale, that it had been downhill all the way, yes? And the other was the kind of brisk, rather starry-eyed, rather glib, progressivist way, that that modernity was just an enthralling emancipation and you couldn't get enough of it. The kind of view you get from old-fashioned 19th century rationalists like Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. What Marx did perversely and magnificently was to say both things are right. History has been a tale of enthralling emancipation, modern history, a tale of civil rights and of feminism and of the extension of republicanism and democracy and the accumulation of wealth for people, and it has simultaneously been one long, unspeakable nightmare, and, moreover, both of those narratives spring from the same sources. It's not just the old liberal notion of, well, there's a little bit of good and there's a little bit of bad here. It's that there are certain mechanisms that he was very concerned to analyse, certain contradictions, that produce both stories simultaneously. Yes? And I think that only Marxism, now in our day, in our time, tries, as it were, out of different sides of its mouth to tell both stories, and to be deeply suspicious of people who are simply Jeremiahs when it comes to the modern period, or people who are simply Panglosses, people, you know, sanguine and starry-eyed and over-optimistic. Marx, I have a section in the book on Marx and utopia pointing out, which again is not original at all, that Marx was not a utopian thinker. Indeed, although he was a secular Jew, the Jews were forbidden from carving graven images of the future, because that was a way of having the future in your pocket. Yes? The only image for Marx, if you like, of the future is the failure of the present. Marx isn't concerned to dream up fancy new ideas of how we might proceed. Any intellectual can do that, you know, at an exciting moment at 3 o'clock in the morning and scribble it down on a pad by your bed, you know. Yes. What he was in that sense was, in Old Testament terms, not a clairvoyant, not somebody peering into the future. The clairvoyants of our time are those hired by the given system to peer into its entrails and assure our rulers that their profits are safe for another 20 or 30 years. That's the role of a clairvoyant. The role of a prophet is entirely different. The role of a prophet, and Marx was most certainly that, is to point out that unless we change our ways, we aren't going to have a future at all. Or it's going to be pretty unpleasant. Yeah. That's what the Old Testament prophet is concerned with, and I think Marx is absolutely in that tradition. All right, I will simply end, if I may, by reading you, just to whet your appetites even further, a little from the conclusion of this book. Marx had a passionate faith in the individual and a deep suspicion of abstract dogma. He was a good old romantic, as far as that went. He had no time for the concept of a perfect society. He was wary of the notion of equality, not very widely known, and didn't dream of a future in which we'd all wear boiler suits with our national insurance numbers stamped on the back. It was diversity and not uniformity that he hoped to see. Nor did he teach that men and women were the helpless playthings of history. He was even more hostile to the state than the Tea Party is, and saw socialism as a deepening of democracy and not as the enemy of it. His model of the good life was based on the idea of artistic self-expression. When Marx thinks of production, he thinks of it in an enormously rich and capacious way. He's not talking primarily about, you know, churning out objects in factories. He's actually talking about production as a delight in itself. He believed that some revolutions might be peacefully accomplished and was in no sense opposed to social reform. He didn't focus narrowly on the manual working class. Marx knew that the great majority of workers in his own society were domestic female servants. Yes? He talked about the proletariat in terms of the industrial, as it were, blue-collar working class. He was perfectly aware that the great majority of working people were women in his own society, and moreover were domestic servants who were not, as it were, conventionally employed in productive labour in the way that that's normally understood. Nor did he see society in terms of two starkly polarised classes. He did not make a fetish of material production. On the contrary, he thought it should be done away with as far as was possible. His ideal was leisure and not labour. If he paid such unflagging attention to the economic, it was in order to diminish its power over humanity, as I said before. His materialism was fully compatible with deeply held moral and spiritual convictions. He lavished praise on the middle class and saw socialism as the great inheritor of its legacies of liberty, civil rights and material prosperity. Other Marxists since, of course, have pointed out that if you don't have that kind of legacy and you try to build socialism, you are, alas, very likely to end up with that monstrous caricature of socialism that we know as Stalinism. His views on nature and the environment were, for the most part, startlingly in advance of his own time. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that, as they say, if Marx were alive today, he would be at the spearhead of the environmental movement. There has been no more staunch champion of women's emancipation, world peace, the fight against fascism, or the struggle for colonial freedom than the political movement to which his work gave birth. Was ever a thinker so travestied? But I do assure you, the rest of the book is even better than that.
What are the threats there that actually here in the West that in this two-pronged kind of thing that they're doing, that they will revert back, that they will very seriously revert back on these values that they say that they uphold, and shift to a kind of, as I said, Chinese model of authoritarian capitalism, so as to keep the system alive, because as we've seen, it does work, or it's working better at least.
All right, let's first of all the Marx and Engels or Laurel and Hardy question, as it were. Yes, I don't. Sorry, who was asking that? You was yourself. Yeah. I don't allow to say much about that in the book because there isn't really space. But Engels has been, of course, very much, in a way, the inferior partner, treated as an inferior partner. In many ways, there are whole, I think, aspects of Marx and Engels' work, whereas Engels is much more, quite more pioneering and erudite and well informed. So I say at the beginning of the book, when I say Marx, I mean Marx and Engels, but that needs to be spelled out much more. There has, of course, recently been some very good work on Engels' own. So, yes, I agree very much, comrade. Not only was 9/11 not the beginning, but there never is a beginning, is there? If you say, well, the paperclip was invented in Norway in 1903, which I think is true, actually. It was certainly invented in Norway. And then, somebody at the back will say, no, they've just discovered one in an Etruscan tomb. Of course, there's never a beginning. That's part of the nature of historicity, and you're quite right that the movement was underway, very importantly, in the 1990s. I think, however, that 9/11 was the beginning in this sense, that it quite obviously triggered a certain grand narrative called the so-called War on Terror, which was then complexly interrelated with the ones that you were talking about. Yes, reverting to authoritarian capitalism. No possibility that we may not. I mean, the one thing that I again try to point out in the book is that although Marx speaks in some ways as though he's a determinist, that socialism is inevitable, he thought so. He did, in a sense, quite often think that socialism was inevitable, although not for the reasons some people think he did. Not because he thought there was an internal dynamic in history inexorably leading us into the socialist kingdom, just because he thought that, empirically speaking, capitalism was bound to go on hitting greater and greater convulsions and crises, and that there would come a point where there would be, as it were, no rational ground for people not to take it over in a socialist direction. Now, that's a sort of qualified kind of determinism, and I'm very dubious about that myself, because I don't think there's any, one can say what people inevitably will do in a certain situation. I don't believe you can do that. That's a kind of determinism. And certainly Marx, a lot of the time, talks as though he's not a determinist, because of course if he were, then why bother about political agency? Why not just lie back and let yourself be born on the tides of history? So this is a roundabout way of saying, I know your question isn't about determinism, but there's no reason why the whole project couldn't come massively unstuck. We live at an incredibly precarious and alarming as well as exuberant and exhilarating time. And those are sides of the same coin. And certainly your implication is right, that if you wanted to draft a form of capitalism which was as secure as that sickeningly unstable system can ever be, you would do it in politically authoritarian ways. You would try to combine a market economy with an authoritarian state, absolutely.
Okay, more questions?
How do you think you can how do you think you can rehabilitate the image and the ideas of Marx to a wider public? Is that something that run out of all the time is kind of like, oh, communism, it's not a viable alternative. It's not seen as a viable alternative. So how do you think you can rehabilitate that?
There's a statement, I think, labour is an eternal nature-imposed necessity. How does that work with the idea that you end up without having to labour?
Yes, yeah.
It's more just a brief comment on what you said about China, the question that came. Because in today's Financial Times, it's quite an interesting article on a phenomenon that's happening in China at the moment, which is luxury sales.
Writing books on Marx like this one may play a modest role in rehabilitating his image in a world where Stalinism in particular has made Marxism one of its less remarked upon crimes, I think. It's made Marxism stink in the nostrils of people who otherwise might benefit very much from it. You know, that's one of the less visible crimes as well. But of course one won't do it primarily by writing books, whatever part that may play, but to wait upon the march, not to wait upon, but it will be produced, if at all, as it were, generated from the march of historical events. It's not in that sense, in that sense I think it's not intellectuals who have a role, of course, to play, but who call the tune. They can't legislate in that way. And indeed, what we're looking at, of course, are forms of spontaneous radicalism, democracy, socialism, which don't, frankly, usually owe a great deal to the Marxist tradition, or for that matter, to any particular tradition at all. Yes, that is to say, coming out of people who really, for no fault of their own, very often have no political memory. I taught for 30 years at something of a ruling class institution, Oxford University, where I watched the way in which students, again, not for their fault, ceased increasingly to have anything politically important to remember. Yes, their memories were, as it were, erased. And in traditional Marxist thought, that is an enormous problem because, as Walter Benjamin says, and that's always an excellent way to start a sentence, it's not, and again the point is, as it were, an anti-utopian one, it's not, he says, dreams of liberated grandchildren that drive men and women to revolt, it is memories of enslaved ancestors, a very Judaic remark to make. So we might have to rethink, you know, what then happens in a situation where you have a great deal of socialist militancy, but it's not really coming from the same sources or from that particular respect for the past. The respect for the past that was captured by Trotsky when he said, we Marxists have always lived in tradition. Radicals, of course, have classically been traditionalists, yes, with enormous respect for the precious resources of tradition, because if you destroy the past, you destroy those resources and you don't have a future. You know, that's why the ruling class asks us to, you know, mindless mantras like, you know, drawing a line onto the sand, in the sand and moving bravely forwards, and, you know, adds the mindless phrase going forward to everything it says, even when it's asking for a ham sandwich or whatever it is. The point about yes, labour is a necessity. We don't choose it. We don't do it necessarily because we like it. We do it because the kind of species that we are, I think, is a part of the point that Marx is getting at. We're the sort of species who need to transform our environment, our natural environment, in order to have the kind of history that we have. So there's not a choice in that sense. Marx there is actually very close to Freud. Freud thought that without the goad of labour and the necessity of labour, we would simply sort of lie around the place all day in various interesting postures of jouissance. You know. Freud was Freud in a sense believed in the old base and superstructure model. He thought it was the economic that made us, that, you know, determined the need for labour. But I think Marx is realistic about this. He doesn't say a lot about this. He's realistic, I think, in thinking that, well, we must try and get rid of degrading forms of drudgery as far as possible, and the great scandal of capitalism, of course, is that it's developed the resources to do so, but given the social relations it operates within, it won't and can't do that. The point about China, and the comment who came back quite rightly on the point about Chinese authoritarianism, yes, the fragility and the self-doubt even of China's ruling elite. I was in China long before all that happened for a bit, and what struck me there was just the opposite. That actually under the old Maoist, or whatever you want to call it, regime, post-Maoist, Stalinist, there was talk of what the Chinese call the iron rice bowl. Does he or she have an iron rice bowl? Meaning security for life, food for life, yes. And you know, a lot of people at that point were quite happy, not happy in general with the regime, but that was provided for, that in a paternalist and autocratic way, that was provided for, and alas, absolutely no longer the case, even for the rulers. Quite right.
Okay, so more questions?
Yes, comment. I like very much your reference to the first 9/11. I think it's very important in terms of the rescue of the past for present action. Neoliberalism didn't start in the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher. Neoliberalism...
There's always a previous crisis to go back to, and in this case it was the early 1970s, the oil crisis, all of that. Nothing new, you said, and that's right too. I mean, in a way, you know, what I suppose what one's saying is there's nothing new in the system in that sense, because it is cyclical. You know, for all its brave new world dreams of history as linear, onwards and upwards, progressive. In fact, the same old tedious things come back, and maybe they come back to a different degree or in a different guise. But that was certainly one of the reasons, wasn't it, why Marx was so concerned with what he calls, actually, the name he gives to all this is prehistory. You know, Marx won't even, as it were, dignify what's happened to date with the word history. The only true history, the only really historical act, would be to break with all that somehow and get to a point where people could, in their vast variety and complexity, begin to create their own stories and histories, and that for him would be history proper. The most historic event will be the break from prehistory to real history, as it were, and about real history he has famously, or notoriously, very little to say, because you can't pre-draft that kind of freedom. You can talk about the institutions that might guarantee it, or help to support it, but it's by definition, if you're talking about people being free to take control of their own destinies, then that's something that goes beyond a scheme that you might have. The point about democracy that John raises is very important, and both, as it were, the importance of the enormous new emphasis upon that, the word being on everybody's lips, as you say, John, but also the need to interrogate that somewhat critically. You know, notoriously, democracy is a catch-all term, isn't it? You know, what state doesn't use it to justify its hideous instruments of torture or oppression and so on? And we must be aware too, I take this to be the drift of what you're saying, John, we must be aware too of that so slightly glib use of the word, you know, on the left. As I said when I read out the conclusion to my book, Marx is against the given democracy we have, but not because it's democracy, because it isn't truly democracy, because it's not. Democracy has to penetrate to every part of society, including crucially the process of production, material goods and services and so on. And problem here for the theory, as you began, John, by saying, is that there is something, I mean, post-French Revolution, there's something of a scant history of this. What Marx points to, of course, is largely the Paris Commune. He said, if you want an image of what I'm talking about, then there it is, something like that. You know, though he also was quite aware that many of the communards were not socialists, for example, but something like that. But of course, we're talking here about a very short-lived, precarious event put down in blood and fire. So there's a limit to the degree to which one can extrapolate from it, as it were, for the present. So yes, in that sense, theory doesn't stop. Absolutely right. However hard it has to hobble to catch up with practice, it also has to interrogate it, in the name of a certain history, in the name of a certain grasp of deeper mechanisms of what's going on. Yes. Just the point, sorry, was about the economic. Somebody asked about. Yes, yourself. Yes. I think my book has so far converted the Department of Economics of London, Oxford, Cambridge. Judging by reviews from economists, we have a long way to go. And those journals who have, as it were, given my book to economists to review have done so in a very politically tendentious kind of way. But I think, again, one of the points that Marx questioned, or Marxism was questioned, is what is this thing that people call the economy? What is this thing that the Daily Telegraph or the FT or BBC News calls the economy? This strange, rather fetishized abstraction from the whole mass of social relations and social interactions and forms of power and forms of ideology. The very act of extracting that and calling that the academic discipline of economics is itself a very loaded one. Marx refuses that kind of act of abstraction just as he refuses to abstract technology from the same social context.
Okay, I think we can just about squeeze in 3 more questions, but do keep them very brief. So,
related to this image, young people in this country and Marxism. Marxism in
sorry, I do need to get in someone else.
Yeah,
Thank you. Can you? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Usually Marxists are all generation and
thank you. Okay, Chris.
I just wanted to ask about a bit more about the question of kind of inevitability and determinism, because what always strikes you about Marx is that on the one hand he saw the kind of he had a deep respect for the forces of
I didn't. The Bourdieu question. I don't know anything about this rehabilitation of capital. All I know is that Bourdieu once told me that he said that whereas Foucault was invited everywhere in France, he, who had been at university with Foucault, was invited almost nowhere. And I said, well, why is that so? He said, well, I think it's because Foucault talks about aesthetics and I count how many people go into museums. So French pecking order there. Fortunately, that's not an answer to your question, but I don't know about that rehabilitation idea. Yes, the question at the point at the back, we have to be careful, as you say, to be judicious and to be balanced about communism. And I think I say in the book that point out that, for example, East Germany had, I think, what was regarded as the best childcare system in the world at one point, not only in Europe, but in the world. Yeah? And that has to be, one has to give credit where it's due to all of those ways, to all of those social benefits of which now people feel in those parts of the world terribly stripped and deprived at exactly the point where an aggressive market capitalism then moves in upon them. So having been, as it were, weakened by being deprived of those benefits, they then are even more prey to a new kind of attack. So yes, I absolutely agree with that. Chris's point about determinism, yes, perhaps it might be worth just thinking here, Chris, about the fact that freedom for Marx involves determination, doesn't it, in the sense that freedom for Marx is self-determination. There are different theories of freedom, as we all know. There's what's sometimes called negative ideas of freedom, freedom from regulation and so on. But Marx combines the idea of freedom and autonomy with the idea that we're not magically free of determining forces by saying, as far as possible, we have to be able to determine our own destinies. That's what freedom is about, collectively speaking as well. And that again, of course, is by no means original to him. That was part of the good old romantic tradition. What is original, I think, there to Marx to some extent, is he says, and we must talk about the social and material conditions that would allow this to be possible. That's the thing that he adds to it.
Just to remind everyone, your passports out of here are here. And the next session's